Alright guys, so this is an Enel deck profile right before EB01 comes out. This is pretty much my look from what we can put in from starter deck 13. I think there are a couple cards and additions we can add to it. I don't think it makes Enel necessarily the most meta relevant deck, but it's a deck that I'm super comfortable with playing. I'm very good into the Sakazuki matchup, into the Katakuri matchup. I think it really depends more on the player rather than the card quality itself in that aspect. Gekko Moria is still pretty tough, but there are some kind of workarounds and game plans that you can do to try to make the matchup at least a little bit easier. So we'll kind of go through, all the options I have, the reason behind every single card, because this deck is strictly built for the meta. Each card has a specific purpose in its own matchup, which I think greatly helps, the deck's performance. Enel is a relatively defensive leader to begin with. When you take 1 life, you go down to 0. Leader skill procs, you can gain 1 back, dish 1 from hand. So it's a very defensive leader innately. But the way I've always liked to play my Enel and the structure behind it is being very aggressive and just relying on that leader skill to buffer the defense naturally. So I enjoy building mine defensively. We'll go through all the options and everything, really kind of break down why some matchups are a bit better than others, what makes them tougher than others, and kind of everything there. So I think what we'll go ahead and start with, we'll just start with, the 2Ks. 2Ks are pretty standard in Enel and in yellow. Most yellow decks run anywhere between 10 and 14 most likely, but, for Enel, first up we got is the Kozuki Hiyori. So this card is a pretty good 2K. It's, on play, add 1 card from the top or bottom of your life to your hand, and then put 1 from your hand to the top of your life. So this lets you set up some trigger plays early game if you want to, whether it's getting out, the Kikunojo, or setting up a Sheer Hoshi or an Onami, stuff like that. Kind of just helps you set up your early game plays, but also has an additional effect with one of that we are running in the deck. And next 4 we got are the Satori. This card is obviously great, really good early game trigger, just lets you get a free body on board more or less. That way you can start swinging early, put on the pressure, which I am a fan of doing in Enel. So there's no reason to not run this card, at least for right now. You could make some arguments coming EB01 and set 7, but for right now I think this card is perfect and the deck really helps the aggression. And then the definitive 4 of almost always is Beige. Hitting that last life, or even in a mid-game kind of spot where it's important, negating an entire attack for the turn, very good. Sometimes just helps, win games outright. How many times do people say, Beige for win, or, stuff like that. So extremely good trigger, definitely can pop up where you need it to. And because you regen so much life, your chances of hitting triggers naturally increases because you just have more life to go through and hit triggers. So this is pretty much the lineup for 2Ks, very standard, very straightforward. I'm a fan of 12. I've thought of putting in a 1 of Makino from Star Deck 13, just so we can kind of take the 1 life and then look at all our other options to set up afterwards. I don't think it's necessarily too good because you are eating the life. You can choose to take the life and not put anything back with Hiyori, but I don't think that's usually in your best interest. You rather just soak up the hits with Enel rather than just eat through your life with your own cards. So those are the 2Ks that I like to run. I think 12 is a good number, and I don't think I would go anything less than 10, but I do like 12 because we do like to be defensive. Next up, we'll go through a lot of the trigger cards that kind of pop out of life, minus the Satori and whatnot. So these are kind of bodies that we can play from trigger. So first up is Kikunojo. This card pretty much everyone knows about. It's a 4/6, so really good stat line. And then on KO, if your opponent has 3 or less life and this character's KO'd, you regain 1 life. So this is really good into the Gekko Moria matchup because there's no other way for them to clear it except for KO, whether it is by battle or through effect. So if you can get them down to 3 life and you proc this, that does help buffer. It could be a very sticky unit because they just might not want to deal with it. So I like this at a 4 of, trigger is very easy. Opponents at 3 less life, just play it for free. No discard or anything like that. So very seamless play. It's also pretty good into the Katakuri matchup just because, you want to push that aggression, really kind of deal with that. Sakazuki, it's nice if you just get it out as a body on the board. Sakazuki and bot deck things very easily, especially 4 costs. 4 costs are very removable right now in the meta. And again, Sakazuki, bottom deck is definitely an option. But it still allows us to just put out that early game pressure or late game body if we need, another attacker. We get this out of life. It's a good late game body. Next up, I do a 1 of Cracker. I've had this at 2 for a while, but I opted to go down to a 1 of. Cracker is really nice. Just is kind of that extra body from trigger. Ditch 1, played out from trigger, 4/5. But if you are less life than your opponent, gains double attack. In this meta, I've kind of noticed that Enel often is at less life than my opponent, except if it's like Black Ale Luffy. That's kind of the exception. But against Katakuri, against Gekko, you see this early out of trigger or plate from hand going second for dawn. Your double attack is live, so they have to remove that, and that definitely puts some pressure on them to deal with it relatively soon, or it could bite them. Sakazuki, doesn't quite have many implications because 1, it's very removable for Sakazuki. 2, Sakazuki hardly is ever less life than you unless you just really just eat through your life, which you can, which is fine. But most times he's not too relevant, but he's really just there for those 5 life leader matchups, and I think a 1 of is fine. I was at 2, which is nice, but I kind of want to make space for other cards. So 1 up for Cracker I think is good. And next up, these are pretty much our removal options, or one of the removal options we have for the deck out of trigger, which is Onami. So Onami, out of trigger, KO of 5 cost or less for your opponent, which is nice, can just help shut down one of the attackers. You know, nice against Sakazuki, nice against Moria for that early game sort of removal threat, so we don't have to deal about one more body. And, you know, in the yellow matchup, very nice as well, because we apply Banish, so if our leader swings or a character swings and we have Banish on it, you know, in yellow, it's very nice against that, since we can negate the possibility of a trigger, which sometimes is life-saving. You know, there's sometimes you can banish a Beige out of life, banish a 2K out of life, even this out of life. So I think a 3 of is nice, because we'll see it, but we won't see it too much, and it allows us to make space for some other cards in the deck. And next up is our Shirahoshi. So I have been jumping between 4 and 3 copies here and there. I've opted to stick with the 4 copies because hitting this thing out of trigger with a deck how it's constructed is just, it's so necessary, because it is our main form of cycle within the deck, finding the pieces we need at the right times, as well as pretty much unbricking us. Yellow is really becoming to the point where the bulk of its counter power is through its 2Ks. We aren't running too many 1Ks within the deck, so we need to be able to cycle cards that are dead in hand, dead in the moment, so we can either get more defensive power or find the right card that we need. And I think finding this at a 4 of is very nice. It allows us to set it up with Hiyori if we do need to. It allows us to put it back to life with Katakuri, get that sort of, you know, recycle once again. It's a very good card. You know, it really does what it does and helps the deck just find the pieces it needs at the right times. So that is pretty much it for what we got for triggers out of life, as for bodies, as well as some other effects, minus, you know, the events and whatnot. And this next segment is going to be probably where I find I've catered my deck to the meta the most, is pretty much the mid game. The mid game for Enel is very important because the bulk of our emphasis is late game, but if we can have a strong mid game, that's very good. So starting out, we got the 4 Gadatsu. So Gadatsu KOs based off of your opponent's life count. So against 4 life leaders, he doesn't have as great of an implication, just because usually they'll be down to 3, so we can't really pop, you know, the important bodies that we would like, such as, you know, 4 cost bodies and whatnot. But against 5 life leaders, Gecko Moria and Katakuri, extremely nice, because, you know, we are able to pop those 4 cost bodies on curve appropriately, whether first or second. And he's a 1K counter, which, you know, we actually do need in the deck. Just, you know, we can throw away. And so he's very nice, good removal, 5/6. So it does take some effort for Gecko Moria or Sakazuki to remove. You know, either takes a Help Meppo for -3, you know, Great Eruption +1 if you're Moria, or just Ice Age, or even Hina. Definitely is removable, but if they can't remove it right away, you know, he'll do that one swing, get you that pressure, which is nice. And, you know, he's just a great on-curve play, mid-game play, which we need in order to help mitigate the rush that we're feeling. As Enel, you're fine with taking life, but you want to make sure you're taking it sort of on your terms, and you're knowing when to take the proper life versus, you know, when you can't take that and you need to be a bit more defensive. And so that is one of the reasons that I also decided to run a 1 of Sabo. I have jumped between 2 to 3 as well. I've really just tried to figure out how many Sabo I like to have. The reason behind Sabo is, 1, it's another removal option, and 2, it's a removal option that is sometimes better than Gadatsu. Because Sabo, he does trash your life, but can KO a 5 cost or less. So he really helps figure out that, or fix that range that Gadatsu sometimes isn't able to do. If we're up against a 4 life leader, they go down to 3 quickly, our Gadatsu is offline for pretty much the rest of the game on targets that we would want to hit. Sabo helps us make up that difference where we can pop, you know, pop those 4 cost Kuzans. You know, late game, if they don't replay a Sabo, we can pop a Sabo off that if we're fine with trashing our life and going for game. Against Red Purple Law is extremely nice because they get wide very quickly, and if they eat that first life, they'll be at 3 life for you know, that follow-up turn. Sabo helps us clear one of those units. If it's a kid, that's even better. You know, we clear a 5 cost blocker kid off the board. We're fine with giving up that 1 life because, you know, Enel is a defensive leader innately, so we're very fine with sort of just eating that, and, you know, getting that 1 extra body off the board is nice. And, you know, he's a 1K counter, which is good, 5/6 stat line, so we definitely take that. And so rounding out, you know, our rest of our sort of mid-game / 5 cost units, because for the bulk of it, our 5 cost units are our mid-game plays. You know, we run a diverse range in order to answer as many questions and problems that we can, because that's kind of what you have to do in One Piece in general. Is, you know, the cards that you have in hand, your goal is to answer the questions that your opponent gives you, whether that is, you know, applying more pressure, dealing with a unit on board. That is really the goal that we have. So that is why I decided to structure our 5 cost unit in mid-game sort of how it is. We have our 5 removal options. I decided to run 2 of Ace, 5/7 stat line, 2 or less life, you gain rush. Extremely good card in order to put on the aggression. And this card is especially good into, you know, the Sakazuki matchup as well as the Gecko Moria matchup. The reason for the Sakazuki matchup is because they don't like being pressured early. If they have to use a lot of their cards from hand in order to combo off pieces to start removing your board, their card count in hand goes down dramatically. And dealing with, you know, a 7k swing on a 5-Don turn is not something they want to deal with. So it really helps the aggression of the deck really poke where we need to. Against Gecko Moria, you know, it's good aggression. Against Katakuri, it's very good aggression, because in Katakuri, it's kind of a race a little bit. You know, their late game arguably is better than our late game, but if we can sort of speed up the game, sort of hit those strides early, really apply the pressure, you know, we're in a pretty good spot. And, you know, against other 4 life leaders, Ace is just really good. Against Red Purple Wall, you know, they can minus it and whatnot, but the nice thing about this, because it is 7k, it takes 2 cards for them regardless to bring it down to, you know, 3k range, unless it is Fire Fist or sort of an event like that. If it's characters, you know, they played, it has to be 2 characters. So we're getting 2 cards out of hand, which is very nice why it's 7k. You know, these 6 cost units are also, or 6k units are very nice as well, including the, you know, Kikunojo in that matchup, because it is going to cost, you know, a 1/3 unit, whether it's a Gordon or, you know, Raise Max. It's going to cost using one of them to remove them. They can't get just, you know, minus 2k. That won't suffice. So that is why this spread is very nice. I find that we're able to answer a lot of those mid-game kind of questions based off what we need. The reason behind the one of Momonosuke is there are times that we just need to be straight defensive. And if we're mid-game and, you know, we played the Hiyori out, we have this opening hand, we played the Hiyori out, we can kind of just get that refill back to life. I've kind of noticed having that one extra defensive option where it's either putting something back to life just so we can kind of gain that buffer, or it is just having him, the fact that he is a blocker. One of, I think, is nice. You could go 2 if you want, but I think space is very tight with the deck. So that one of kind of just option, you know, even late game, it's very important that we always have a card to gain that 1 life to put us back up to 2. That is extremely important. Sometimes he is able to just do that because, you know, we do cycle so much throughout the deck with this sheer Hoshi and whatnot. And I find that just one of, you know, blocker, put the Hiyori back to life, we gain a 2k back to hand. It's not doing anything on us for board, so we're not minusing in any fashion. It's very good, very helpful. So that really rounds out pretty much our, you know, 2Ks mid-game sort of trigger cards for the most part. Every card has a reason, every card has its matchup. So next we'll go in a bit to the top end. So definitive, this will probably never change, at least until we just get power crept cards, is a 4 of Yamato. This card is extremely important whether you're going first or second. You know, 9 down turn, you play it on curve. This allows you to eat life, build your hand up, and then you can play this, go back up to 2 life, pop something depending on your opponent's life count and your life count. So it's just very good. It's not easily removable, kind of. You know, Gecko Moria and Sakazuki, with Gecko plays, they can obviously do it, you know, whether it's Gecko Moria with Ice Age or Sakazuki with, you know, Helmeppo, Hina, Gecko Moria, and then a 2-cost event. That does definitely remove it, and it is a tempo play. But for us, you know, being able to gain that life up, be more defensive, and really our plan is to get as many big bodies out on the board as we can. That is kind of the goal with Enel. If we can build our base of big bodies, it becomes very overwhelming for our opponent to deal with. We're regaining life every time. Our defense is pretty natural. We have good defensive triggers and options laid throughout the deck. So really just kind of, if we need to get to that late game, stall that late game, it is possible. But like I said, I liked being aggressive Enel. Enel is deceptively aggressive where, you know, if you pressure them enough early life, they get scared about the late game and they might not be able to have as many resources or hold on late game. And so that's kind of where, you know, some of our life regeneration comes back into play. I am on 3 Katakuri. Most lists are on 4. I am fine with 3. I could run 4 if I want, but, you know, I find that 3 is, you know, kind of just where I need to be. It's probably about 70% of the time, I rather would use this to regain a life than remove my opponent's threat. Because the times that I am playing this, I'm most likely down to 1 life. So unless I'm like really need to get something off the board as soon as possible, I would rather regain a life, give myself an extra turn, sort of see if I can stabilize by that point, and then deal with my opponent's board after. Against Gecko Moria, the leader, it's a tough card to really want to use because sometimes you want to out their Gecko Moria, but their board is already so wide, so you really have to make the right decision on, you know, what you're going to use for it. But it is a good option. In most cases, it is one of our guaranteed life refillers, which is necessary. We only have a couple of them in the deck, and we need to make use of them as much as we can, because that is really our goal with the deck, is always to make sure we can get back up to 2 life and, you know, just kind of stabilize at those points. So we're going to clean this up a little bit here so we can kind of make space for the rest of the stuff we got. And so yeah, the next couple cards we got is going to round out our top end, which, you know, I would say these slots are probably more the flexible slots that people are thinking about, but I will go into the reasons why I decided to run both of them, because I think their importance, they each have their own roles and timings for when those roles should be filled. So what we are on is a split of 3 7-drop Big Mom and 2 Rush Enel. So I'll start with the Rush Enel just because I've always been on this card. When I won my case tourney back in 05, I wasn't running this, but Rush Enel was such a big factor. The reason for Rush Enel is mainly the Katakuri and the Sakazuki matchup. The Katakuri matchup because it is a rush character that we can play on curve, going second or first, and we just want to apply as much pressure as we can to really make it uncomfortable for 10 drop Big Mom to come out. And it's also a very sticky card. Self promo, but within my own channel. The series I'm doing against my friend Sakazuki versus Enel, this card is extremely important. That is probably the main reason we run this card is the Sakazuki matchup. It's a very sticky card. It is not easily removed for them off the board, and it really helps us put that pressure. Ideally, if you go second against Sakazuki, they'll put you down to 2 life quickly. You'll go leader swing, you'll play ace, then next turn you'll play Enel. That is a lot of pressure for Sakazuki to deal with that they don't have enough counter or cards in hand to remove your board and protect their life at the same time. So they have to make sacrifices somewhere. And just the amount of pressure that, these 4 cards apply because they are rushed, because they are both 7Ks, it's very good pressure. It gets Sakazuki down in their life count to the point where they're going into their 9 or 10 Dawn turn on 1 life or 2 life, and you are able to close out very easily because they have to deal with your board while also making sure they have defensive up at the same time, which sometimes they just aren't able to do. So these 2 cards for that rush aspect are very nice, and this card especially because it is very sticky in that matchup. Against Gecko Moria, it isn't quite as good for a couple of reasons. One, Gecko Moria naturally has more bulk being a 5-cost leader. So I find that rush sometimes isn't going to work out as well because their hands are kind of naturally bulkier, and they flood their board a lot faster. So it's still a good card in that matchup, but definitely I would prefer, this is kind of where 7-drop Big Mom comes in. I would prefer to see 7-drop Big Mom in the Gecko Moria matchup. 1, it's an 8K hitter, so it does slightly get above those levels, but 2, it's because it forces the Gecko Moria to either accelerate the game by 1 turn or extend the game for me by 1 turn, because they have to choose whether to trash a life or give me a life. In Enel, whenever I gain a life, I'm more or less extending the game by 1 turn for myself, because if I'm at 2 life, it always is going to take my opponent 4 hits to close out the game. And our game plan is naturally defensive. We have triggers out of life that we can hit that can help, bolster the defense. So that is kind of what we aim to do. And if they choose to trash the life, that kind of, that's accelerating the game by a turn, because, we do have the rejects, we do have power, we have, big bodies that can help us in the late game. So the Gecko Moria matchup is by far the toughest matchup. It's not unwinnable, but it is quite difficult because they do get wide very quickly. And I find that with 7-drop Big Mom, it allows us to deal with a life per turn if we need to. And also, not have to worry about, do I go for life? Do I go for board? We can go for board with the other units we have on board. We can go for life through the effect of 7-drop Big Mom, assuming they don't give us the life. But this is also good into the Sakazuki matchup as well, because it does cost them to, make a decision on what they're going to do. Sometimes just getting that 1 guaranteed point of damage and building a sticky character is nice, which is why I do run the Enel. But, this option is also very good. Against Yamato as well, forcing your opponent to make that decision. I find this deck has a pretty good matchup into Yamato because we are defensive naturally. You should be eating life against Yamato for the most part, because their double attack when you're at 1 life is meaningless. It's 1 point of damage, and then we recover 1 point of damage. So their rushers at that point, depending on your hand shape or hand state, are kind of neutralized to an extent. So I like the 3-2 split. It gives us options for what we need depending on the scenario. And we have a more sticky body, more aggressive body. We have a bigger body that causes our opponent to really dictate the pace of the game at that point. But we have so many options that we're fine with that, and we can maneuver pretty easily. So that rounds out more or less our top end. And next up, we're going to the events. The events for the most part are pretty standard. We have 2 of the 0-cost event. It's very nice because we do run a lot of non-counter cards in the deck. So we are able to make use of that on a very consistent basis, making sure we can ditch something, gain 3K, but also, the fact that the trigger is, when you're at 0 life, ditch 1 Enel leader skill basically, and, you can just regain right there. So you could go back up to 2 life if you hit this with the Enel leader skill. And, that's just very nice. Sometimes that wins you games, just outright. Sometimes your opponent needs that 1 more hit. You hit this, it's pretty much a beige, right? Infinite power value, more or less. And then we are at 2 of Amaru. So this card is very good, rest of 4 costs or less, so whether that's Rebecca, Borsalino, any kind of chump blockers to that extent, it's very nice. More times than not, I find that the power bump is usually what I'm, using it more for, just so we can scale some bigger numbers or bigger and better numbers. So the rest is obviously nice, it's very important, but sometimes just that extra 1K is really just kind of what seals the deal. And obviously the trigger effect, trash 2 cards, gain 1 life, very good, sometimes wins you games as well. Anything that negates an attack or gains you 1 extra life, for infinite value, technically speaking, it's very good. So these life-saving triggers, very important, very good. And then lastly, I am on 2 reject. these two cards, I have played at 3, I've played at 2-3, I played at 3-2. It is obviously a great card. You know, you can either KO a 5 cost in the mid game, sort of late game, or, you know, with the other effect, you take a life, you deal your opponent's last life of damage to their hand. Guaranteeing a point of damage for 4 Dawn it's not a bad investment by any means. Sometimes it does just win you games outright with this combo. You know, it just happens. You know, if your opponent isn't set up correctly for it, that combo will just win you games. I would like to go to 3, but sometimes I see it too much. And, you know, there are times where Sabo is just going to wall you out the game. And if you have this card in hand, there's just not really much you can do about it. So I like 2. I'm pretty fine with the 6 events. If I could go increase them, then maybe you take out the Momonosuke, maybe the one of Cracker, and, you know, put them back up to 3 respectively. But I do have the reasons for the one of options, so that is why I decided to put these at 2, 2, and 2. So, you know, kind of take it as you will, adjust the deck how you want, but there's a reason for every card in this deck for its respective matchup. You know, we have our aggression for the Sakazuki and Katakuri matchups. These cards are really kind of for the Gecko matchup, extend that late game, drain them out of resources. In the matchups I've had with Gecko, often I find that, you know, their resources in hand do go down quite quickly, and then the main bulk of the deck comes from their life count and bodies on board. So I find that this deck with ST13 additions definitely gained kind of a small bump. With Enel, I find that it really depends more on the pilot, kind of. Obviously, you know, yellow triggers luck sack, you know, there's an element of luck to it more than other colors, more than other decks. But I do find that the decisions for the cards I've added in the deck are very personal and sort of my play style. I've had a lot of success with this leader in general, just throughout the course of its tenure. It's a deck that I'm extremely comfortable with. And I would say the key points for the deck that you really need to be aware of in order to kind of get better with the deck is knowing when to be offensive, defensive, and taking your life. There are some times in some matchups where, you know, you're fine with just eating your life. Against Sakazuki, I more or less just eat my entire life because it's very hard for them to go to lethal, you know, any point beyond 9 or 10 Dawn, because they'll have a lot of small bodies. They'll have to allocate a lot of Dawn to make those pokes, and, you know, our hand count will be big. We'll start getting big bodies on board. I've hardly ever struggled with the Sakazuki matchup in 05, in 06, post set, you know, starter deck 13. It's always been a matchup I'm very comfortable with because you just have to know the right timings for when to make those decisions of aggression, defense, clearing your opponent's board, you know, taking that life. So it's a matchup I'm very comfortable with. Katakuri can be a little scary because, you know, they are yellow, so depending on triggers out of life and stuff like that, it can definitely be a variable to the game. But, you know, the aggression that we have with the Ace, with the Enel, clearing with Gadatsu and Sabo, and, you know, our late game isn't quite as good, but, you know, I'd say we have better defense than Katakuri in general, and so we are able to develop a pretty good array of big bodies on board in that matchup as well, which I think can definitely apply pressure and, you know, win out in those games. If you ever play against, you know, if they play 7-drop Big Mom, I would say 9 times out of 10 you should probably just trash the life. The more life you give them, their bulk sort of outpaces you a little bit just naturally through life count, and they can just hit some, you know, crazy triggers, you know, just like this deck, to kind of help them win the game. Gecko Moria, like I mentioned before, definitely the toughest matchup. Going first or second in that matchup, honestly, I haven't found that it matters too much what you decide to do. You could argue just going first just to kind of, you know, start putting the aggression on early. They'll develop their bodies, they'll do their stuff, but if you can get the aggression going with, you know, Ace clearing their board with Gadatsu if you need to, or Sabo getting the Linlin out, slowly just building your board. There was a game I had recently against Gecko Moria. He had 3 Ice Ages. You know, if that happens and they clear, you know, my 2 Big Moms, 2 Yamatos, like, there's only so much you can do in a matchup like that where they're getting wide, they see all their Ice Ages, they're clearing stuff like that. There's only so much you can do. But for the most part, it is definitely a winnable matchup. Obviously, it's going to take a lot more, you know, effort to win those, but it's not unwinnable. I think the deck right now is in a good spot. It slightly gets better in EB01. I'm trying to figure out the list that I'm going into with that. But the main reason for posting this video right now is because there's a Treasure Cup this weekend that I am in. So this is a list I'll be rocking for that. This leader I'm very comfortable with. There's a lot of matchups where, you know, we aren't necessarily favored, but just because the understanding of the deck I have, sort of all the decisions behind each card in it, I'm very comfortable going into pretty much any matchup that I need to. I also think people don't necessarily remember how to play against Enel. If you don't learn how to play against Enel, there are very obvious things that will give me advantage. Some of the points being, you know, if you have 2 swings for your turn and I'm at 1 life, you know, you can swing once with leader, but don't swing with the other cards because you give me free cycle. You know, that's one thing you should be taking advantage as Enel as well, is figuring out when you take life, if you'll get a free cycle for the turn. That way, you know, taking life, you'll be at an advantage for card, you know, hand advantage, and your opponent will kind of just give you more options for what to do. So figuring out when to take life with this leader is a big thing, because your opponent might not necessarily realize that, yeah, it's pointless to swing here, or you can't close out game here. And there are a lot of mistakes that your opponent can make if they don't understand the proper timings and orders of this leader, because of just kind of the defensiveness around the leader itself. So if you guys have any questions when it comes to sort of specifics with the deck, tech choices, card choices, matchups, definitely let me know in the comments. It's a deck I'm extremely comfortable with. I can take into any matchup, and even if it's not favored, I feel very comfortable. One thing to note is, because I forgot to bring it up earlier, is the Black Yellow Luffy matchup. That matchup pre-EB01 is probably one of your easiest matchups ever. You just leave them at 3. You just build big bodies after big bodies after big bodies. They can't eat through their life effectively enough to do that. And so at that point, you just have like 7-drop Big Mom, Yamato, Katakuri, Rush Enel, and you just go big with them, and their hand size can't take it. Katakuri in that matchup is an extremely important card. Let's say they play Sabos early or any of their 5-drops early. You put that card back to life, then you can start swinging at their life, because if you hit that life, that Sabo, Luffy, or Ace is going to the bot deck. So Katakuri in that matchup, extremely good. So that's not a matchup I'm scared of. It is losable if they just see the right cards with the Morias and kind of can outpace you a little bit, so you can't build up your board in time. It is losable, but it's a matchup that you should win. Probably currently before EB01, probably like 70-30. It's a very favorable matchup. Sakazuki for the most part should be a probably 60% Sakazuki, 40% this, but because of how comfortable I am with the deck, I'm not too worried about it. Katakuri, definitely a bit variable, so I would lean more towards 50-50. Gecko Moria probably more that 60-40. It's still a very tough matchup, but it is winnable. So if you guys have any questions, definitely let me know. Definitely a deck list I've wanted to show for a minute. I'll probably do a post EB01 deck list once I sort of figure out where I'm going with that. We have some new options and stuff like that. So appreciate you guys checking out the video, and definitely let me know what you guys might want to see in the future for other decks and stuff like that. And we'll sort of see what we can do. So all right, take care, have a good one.